Welcome to my channel. I'm Ben. Today, we step into a chilling triple homicide in a crowded lodging house in China, where three young women were found bound and stabbed in the middle of the night, and the only clue left behind was a trail of blood dripping from someone's wounded right arm. What really happened in those hours between a night of drinking and the silence that followed? A blade did not need a handle to hurt. Sometimes it lived behind the teeth, honed by pride, alcohol, and the heat of a summer night. Words cut first, thin and invisible. Then real steel followed. In Yuanzhou district of Guyuan City, inside the Ningxia Hui Autonomous Region in north-central China, an old quarter of narrow lanes and pressed-together lives, night usually fell into a hush. On the evening of June 22nd, 2012, that hush dried into a brittle shell and cracked. Somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, three young women would bleed out on a rented room's cold floor. By dawn, the lane outside would fill with neighbors whispering, speculating, afraid to go to sleep the next night. A mother would learn the news by telephone. She was 50, her steps tentative now, as if every move risked shattering her. Just days earlier, she had watched her daughters wave goodbye in the courtyard, headed to the city for a vocal class and a small life adventure. 2 days later, the call said they were gone. The voice on the line belonged to the police. The words were simple. Their wait was not. Morning of June 24th began with a different voice. The landlady's thin with panic as she called the authorities. There were 3 bodies, she said. 3 girls in a second-floor room of her crowded lodging house. When officers arrived, they found the scene had already started to speak in its own language. Blood pooled dark on the floor and printed itself on pillows, blankets, the weave of the sheets. The girls' hands and feet had been bound. 2 lay across a single bed, as if someone had tried to keep them upright and failed. The youngest lay on her back on the narrow strip of floor between the beds, her arms a map of struggle, wounds deep, defensive cuts that told how she had grabbed at a blade and tried to drive it away from flesh. Forensics spoke next. The cause of death in each case was blood loss, from multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. The window of death, the dead of night, between 2 and 3 in the morning. Robbery did not sing true here. Phones were present, wallets, bags. A backpack kept in obvious places had not walked away. Clothing remained neat. There were no signs of sexual assault. Cabinets and drawers stood open, but their emptiness felt staged. A clumsy performance to mislead. On the floor, a repeating print in blood showed a man's shoe, about a European size 41. From the bedroom door to the stairwell, down into the small courtyard, and on toward the gate. A fine trail of droplets marched too steady to belong to the already dying, steady enough to belong to the one who left them there. It suggested the killer bled as he fled, his right arm clamped to his chest to dam the leak, his steps tiring as he crossed from darkness into the paling edge of morning. The lane itself had a memory. People here slept close to each other, close to their walls, and to the lives next door. Around 2 in the morning, one tenant woke to voices overhead, male and female, sharp, then dulled by a landlady's scolding shout from the courtyard, "Quiet down. People are sleeping." The light in the second-floor room still burned. Farther off, a camera at the mouth of a nearby alley had done its own unblinking watching. It had captured the 3 women passing through in the small hours. Then moments later, a lone man entering the same alley, his posture blurred by distance and the grain of night video. In the old city, the place where the alley narrowed felt like a throat. If the man was only a passerby, fate had chosen a brutal place for coincidence. If he was not, then the camera had recorded the first step of a hunt. By mid-morning, rumor ran ahead of facts. 3 killed at once meant something had slipped. Safety. Order. the belief that walls could repel rage. Shopkeepers closed early the next night. Parents told their daughters to stay home. In the courtyard, curious clusters formed and dissolved. In apartments, neighbors tested the new locks they had just bought, sliding bolts back and forth as if rehearsal could stand in for control. Police walked the scene in slow circles, cataloging what could be known and what could be guessed. The open drawers, likely staged. The bindings, tightened by shaky hands under threat. The youngest girl's freed wrist, proof of nerve and of courage. The shoe print, masculine, consistent. The blood trail, leading away. In another city, with wider streets and fewer eyes, a killer might have disappeared into a river of strangers. Here, in a warren where everyone's day traced the same few paths, a man who left at that hour with his right arm pressed hard to his ribs could be remembered by a taxi driver, a night shift cook, a hospital intake nurse. What the officers did not say out loud but felt, like pressure behind the eyes, was that the motive hiding in these four walls did not fit the simplest boxes. No theft, no assault in that particular sense. Anger, yes. Control, absolutely. The way the knots bit into skin said as much. The way the room stopped being a room and became a tiny stage where one voice tried to own the other voices. Words cut first, then steel. By afternoon, the women had names and families again. No longer only shapes in photographs. The landlady recognized one of them, the recent renter, a young woman barely out of her teens who had signed the contract less than a month earlier. Friends and relatives arrived through the gate as if pulled by a rope. The mother, who could no longer steady her steps, stared at each doorway as if a child might walk out and say it had all been a mistake. The father spoke less, a silence with weight to it, as if the words he did not spend might be needed later. In any city, violence leaves a second scene, the one inside the people who remain. This second scene had already begun, spreading through homes and shops, into the way people turned corners, and the way they looked over their shoulders when alley lamps flickered. The official investigation would follow camera angles and lab reports. The community's investigation took another form. The retelling, the cautionary murmurs, the reshaping of the map of night, from a place to breathe to a place you crossed fast, eyes down. This was not a robbery. It was not lust. It was something simpler and more vicious. A collision between wounded pride and opportunity, between alcohol and a late-night encounter that turned a mouth into a weapon. Before the police knew the name of the man who bled as he ran, the city already knew what kind of night it had been. A night when words sharpened each other and found an edge. A night when a door opened to the wrong person because the person knocked instead of broke the lock. A night when all three lives inside were forced to sit still, tied up with cords, as if obedience could undo what had already entered the room. By the time the officers sealed the doorway with paper tape and the last onlookers drifted away, the rented room had finished talking. It had said, they resisted. It had said, he was hurt. It had said, he left by another route. The rest, the why, the face. The first spark tossed between strangers would emerge from the city's other witnesses. Security cameras, hospital ledgers, the one nurse who remembered a man cradling his right arm at dawn. And somewhere in those ledgers and lenses, behind smudged ink and night grain video, the tongue that started it all would flicker again as the memory of an insult no one could take back. The room had already told the police what it was not. It was not a robbery. Phones lay where they had been set down. Wallets and bags sat in plain sight, and nothing of real value had walked away. Drawers yawned open like theater props, a clumsy pantomime of ransacking that convinced no one who knew how real thieves move. The room also refused to be a scene of sexual assault. Clothing remained neat, hymns unbunched. buttons not torn. No forensic trace supported that motive. 3 women, bound. One with a hand freed, and the kind of deep palm slice that comes when someone grabs a blade by its edge. 2 with stab wounds concentrated in the chest and abdomen. No cuts on the hands at all. Killed, while control held tight. Blood told the rest, from the bedroom to the threshold, down the narrow staircase, across the small courtyard, and out toward the gate. Droplets marched in a near continuous line for dozens of meters. All 3 victims had died inside the bedroom. That meant this trail belonged to someone else, the one who left, a man, most likely, given the size and pattern of the shoe prints stamped in red along the way. The steady drip said he was hurt badly, likely in the right arm, and that he left by a different route than he came in. The lodging house sat in an old city maze where alleys squeezed down to single file, and everyone lived within ear's reach. A little after 2 in the morning, the landlady, sleeping on the first floor, woke to the scrape of voices, male and female, above her. She shouted from the courtyard for quiet. Others woke, too, catching brief silhouettes on frosted glass. Hours later, as officers canvassed the block, a camera several turns away had its own memory. At 2:14 in the morning, it recorded the 3 young women walking toward home. Seconds later, a lone man entered the same alley, his back to the lens, his face never shown, his outline blurred by the smear of night video, while forensic techs clipped swabs and bagged tape lifts. Detectives traced the day backward. Where had the women gone? With whom had they spoken? From a sister who ran a bar. They learned about the last hours, singing, dancing, drinking late and happy. One staffer remembered more. A man had shared their table, argued with the renter over who would pay, and in the end threw down money for all 4. Rain started. The group lingered for a dozen minutes, then left together or near enough. The waitress couldn't give a face. The lights strobed, and the night brought a crowd. But the paying man was real. The detail about the bill stuck like a burr. DNA came back fast. Besides the 3 victims, there was a 4th profile, male. That narrowed everything without naming anyone. The paying man got a name first, Li Gang. He admitted meeting the women and paying, but said he had left alone in a taxi, drunk and spent. After they told him they would keep walking, a driver and building camera confirmed he went home and stayed there until morning. That cleared him. Neighbors gave the same song in different keys. Voices at roughly 2 in the morning. The landlady's brief reprimand from the courtyard. Then quiet. The door to the victim's room showed no pry marks. Either a lock was weak, or someone opened the door from within because they knew him, because he knocked softly, or because he moved fast when it swung in. In old city alleys in China, tight, vertical, neighborly domestic arguments and street disputes leak through plaster. That night's leak matched the forensic clock almost perfectly. The search widened anyway. One father, his voice careful, like a man stepping around glass, told police about an older boyfriend who had pressed for marriage. There had been money between them, gifts, loans, the usual mixture that leaves a trace of resentment wherever it dries. The man, Guo, had called and texted late, had shown up at the scene early, too early, before any official notice. But his DNA did not match the blood that dripped away from the room, and no thread tied him to that trail. The detective's wall notebook pages taped together above a desk fan grew with names, and none of them fit long enough to take a pin. They went back to the cameras. If the man had entered one alley after the victims at 2:14, where had he left? Hours into the review, an exit appeared in another lane that connected to the same block. Around 5 in the morning, a man passed at distance, head slightly pitched forward, left hand clamped across his right forearm, as if to keep something inside. The posture read like pain, even through the grain. Now the theory about the blood trail had a body to wear. From there, the search changed shape. Broadcasts went out, a practice common in Chinese cities when a violent suspect is at large, via neighborhood boards, text messages, and local television. Officers asked taxi drivers about early morning fares with bandaged arms, and they visited clinics and hospitals, public and private, including traditional Chinese medicine facilities, where people often seek cheaper, faster treatment. 5 days after the killings, at about 7 in the morning on June 23rd, the same morning as the murders, a man had walked into a TCM hospital with a deep cut on his right arm, registered under his own name. Wang Guyu explained that a kitchen knife had slipped, received a hurried bandage, then left without discharge papers. The hospital had cameras. The image showed his face. The ledger kept his name. Sometimes a city makes its own luck. Detectives went to his room. The shoes in his closet bit the floor with the same sole pattern that had been printed in blood at the scene. His DNA matched the fourth profile. Confronted, he confessed, the words coming in the flat, forward-leaning way of a man who cannot find a place to set any of them down. His story began not with a grudge, but with a bottle. He had been drinking with friends until close to midnight, drifted away, and dozed on a public step near the city square. The way drunks sometimes sleep, where the stone holds the day's heat. Something struck his head, he said, a bottle, and he woke to 3 women nearby. Words lit like tinder. They traded anger. The women walked away. He followed. Not immediately, not close, but close enough to keep them in sight. In his version, he wanted an apology that would make the night unhappen. The ache in his head makes sense. He trailed them through the alleys, waited near the courtyard when he saw their light come on, then climbed the stairs and pushed through the door before fear could tell him not to. Inside, he found a small fruit knife, about 8 inches long, on a table. He said he waved it and told them to be quiet. He told them to tie each other. They did, clumsily. He sat down on the other bed, sick with drink and adrenaline, and closed his eyes. Control that brittle never holds. The youngest had already loosened one wrist, and when she saw his head sag, she grabbed the knife. In the quick, blind clinch that followed, the blade sank into his right arm. He wrenched it back. The room's fragile balance broke. He stabbed her first. Then, shaking and furious and bleeding, he killed the other 2 where they sat. He bound his cut with a shirt from the wardrobe, found his way out a different path, and bled a breadcrumb trail into morning. He took nothing he wanted. He said only the apology that would not come, and after that, silence. The investigation's last chapter read like a return to order. The match to the shoes, the match to the DNA, the straight line from camera to clinic to door. In November of 2012, the court pronounced what the evidence had already written. In China's system, especially in cases with multiple victims, clear forensic links, and a confession, death sentences come swiftly. The city exhaled without relief. The families did not exhale at all. What remained for the storytellers and the neighbors, for the police trainees who would study the case later, was the chain that had made the night possible. Pride turned to fury. Alcohol thinned the brakes. A narrow alley folded chance and choice together until they were hard to tell apart. This was not robbery, and it was not lust. It was control, first sought with words, then with rope, then with a knife, and the illusion that control could put a world back the way it had been 5 minutes before. The night had not run out of eyes. It only chose where to keep them. In the old quarter of Guyuan, narrow lanes curled into each other and carried sound like a river carries drift. When the police pushed open the rented door at first light, the room told them what it could. The rest had to be stitched from people, cameras, and the patience of walking the same paths again and again. One small certainty arrived early. This was not a robbery, and it was not lust. That left a thinner list of motives and a thicker fog. The room whispered about control. It whispered about rage that arrived on quiet feet. But names do not live in whispers. They live in the places people were and the times they moved through. A bar became the first circle on the map. Late on June 22nd, the three women had been there singing, dancing, drinking, swapping the kind of small happiness that makes a night feel larger than it is. Staff remembered a man sharing their table. He paid the bill for all four. He laughed. He left around after 1 a.m. when rain started and held the group in place for a few more minutes. The detail about the bill stayed sharp in the waitress's mind. As if printed with a heavier type, she remembered the argument over who would pay, remembered the man tossing down cash, but she could not give a face. In a club where light flickered like a bad memory, and 100 customers came and went, she had focused on the numbers, not the eyes. The cameras made their own memories. In an alley, a little more than 100 meters from the lodging house, about 328 feet, a lens that watched without blinking captured the women at 2:14 in the morning. Seconds later, it saw a lone man step into the same mouth of alley and head in after them. The view was distant. The colors leaned wrong. The image was soft with night grain. But the shape of a man following three women that close, in that hour, wrote its own suspicion. Back in the station, the lab set a fourth place at the table, besides the three victims. The blood at the scene carried a male profile that did not name a man, but it drew a circle smaller than the city. In a quiet hour, between 2 and 3 in the morning, a man had been inside that room. He had left a piece of himself behind. The camera showed a man following. The room had a fourth DNA. The puzzle's edges began to touch. Detectives worked the bar first. A former co-worker pointed to a name, Li Gang. He had been the man at the table, the one who paid, the one who tried to see the women home. He told the police he had taken a taxi instead, drunk, tired. A camera at his building backed him up. He went in. He did not come out until late morning. In a case where every hour mattered, those hours were solid enough to stand. The suspicion around him fell away. With the obvious man cleared, the search widened like a net drawn through shallow water, catching everything: bar regulars, neighbors, strangers who passed through lanes at the wrong time. Officers carried a clip of the alley footage from door to door. They canvassed more than 700 rental rooms and spoke with more than 3,000 people in the blocks around the scene. Some houses yielded only shrugs and guarded politeness. Others held fragments that fit the clock. The landlady on the first floor had woken to voices around 2 in the morning. A man's voice, local, controlled. A woman hotly and sharp with anger. The landlady shouted from the courtyard for quiet. The kind of practical scolding that keeps peace in crowded housing. Above her, the room's light was still on. She saw vague silhouettes move across frosted window glass. She thought it was a lover's quarrel and went back to bed. Later, she would replay those steps to the window again and again, measuring how far a voice can travel and how little it can change. A tenant down the hall woke too. He heard a spike of argument. He heard the landlady's reprimand drift up from the dark. Then quiet. He slept again, only to learn after dawn that quiet had carried a different meaning. The forensic clock would later put the deaths between 2 and 3 in the morning. A chill alignment with what the building had overheard. In old city housing, the walls keep heat and not secrets. If the door was not forced and there were no pry marks, someone inside had opened it. The man had either been known to them or had moved fast and soft when the door swung. The alley camera, the timeline, the absence of forced entry, the fourth DNA, the single trail of blood leading out to the gate and then vanishing a few meters beyond each piece carried its own weight. Together they suggested a man who had not planned a theft, had not come for sex, but had come looking to claim control, to press a demand, an apology. Silence. Something to make the hurt in his head make sense. The city felt the pressure of the case like a storm that refused to break. Shops closed earlier. Parents counted keys twice. Every woman who walked after dark gave the same small performance phone clutched. Pace quickened at corners, eyes on the angle where an alley narrows. Rumor wrote its own drafts. A jealous lover, a stranger with a knife, a thief interrupted. The police did not have the luxury of rumor. They had to move through the facts in circles, tightening each sweep. They asked again about the night at the bar, what had sparked irritation, who had laughed too loudly. Why did the waitress remember the money, but not the man? The answer lay partly in the craft of memory. People recall conflict, and they recall who settled it. They also recall the weight of cash on a tray, and the relief of a bill paid. Faces are harder, especially under stuttering light. In the end, the bar gave them Li Gang, and Li Gang gave them an alibi. The alley footage gave them a shape and a sequence. 3 women at 2:14, a man seconds later. The building gave them the hour of anger. The lab gave them a 4th person, but the shape still lacked a name, so they walked. They watched entrance cameras on adjacent streets. If a man had entered one alley, perhaps he had left by another, at a different hour, under a different lens. In one clip, distant. Poor around 5 in the morning. A figure crossed with his head tilted forward, cradling his right forearm with his left hand as if holding something in, as if binding a leak. Pain changes posture. Even at that distance, you could read it. And the room had already told them that someone had bled as he fled. The canvas changed character. Now officers asked a different set of people: night shift taxi drivers, private clinics, traditional medicine hospitals that keep early hours and accept patients in cash. They asked about a man with a cut on his right arm, a man who insisted he had sliced himself in a kitchen, a man who did not stay to fill out a form. Word travels differently in tight neighborhoods. It runs along family lines and errands, bends around courtyards, and stops at front desks where nurses notice who favors which side. Pressure has a sound in a police station. It is the sound of chairs scraping back for the 3rd time in an hour, of the same clip rewound and replayed, of officers reading the weather in a city's habits. The longer a violent unknown stays at large, the sharper the edge on every routine call. Everyone knew it. They kept moving. The landlady's description stayed modest. She did not claim to have seen a face. She remembered the tones. The tenant remembered the rhythm. Voices. Reprima, hush. The timing matched the forensic estimate. The sequence matched the camera. The case did not yet have a signature flourish. No criminal genius. No riddle. It had a man who followed. A demand refused. A room turned into a stage for control. In such cases, identification often comes not from a single clue, but from the way all the small clues nod at the same person when you finally say his name aloud. In the days right after the killings, the city shifted a little on its axis. The quarter that usually shook off midnight, as if it were dust held onto it. The lanes looked different when you knew what a camera had seen. A woman hurrying home down a quiet passage can be 3 names and 3 stories. And the man behind her can be coincidence, or he can be the person the city will have to learn to say out loud. That understanding carried the investigation forward, frame by frame, step by careful step, toward the other recordings and the other rooms that would at last, give the man his name. By the time dawn scraped its pale edge across the old quarter, the room had already argued with the simplest theories. Phones were still there. Wallets and bags sat out in the open. A backpack lay where someone had left it. Real thieves do not ignore trophies like that. The drawers were open, yes, but the chaos looked theatrical, as if someone had staged a ransack, because they thought detectives loved toppled furniture. Clothing was neat, nothing suggested sexual assault. In the bedroom, cords bit into wrists and ankles. On the youngest woman's palms, a deep slice ran from lifeline to finger webbing, the mark that appears when a hand closes on a blade to push it away. Meanwhile, a dotted path of droplets ran from the doorway down the stairs, over the courtyard, and out toward the lane. 3 women had died inside. That trail almost certainly belonged to the one who left. The building woke with the story in its throat. Around 2 in the morning, the landlady climbed out of bed and stepped into the little courtyard. She planted herself under the upstairs window and scolded, "Quiet down. People need to sleep." She heard a man's voice, local, controlled, and Ha Lian answering sharp as glass. A tenant down the hall stirred too. He remembered the same rhythm, raised voices, the landlady's reprimand, then quiet that seemed, at the time, like peace. Later, the forensic clock would draw its hard line between 2 and 3, right where the house remembered that hush. The door showed no pry marks. Someone had opened it from the inside, or yielded when it swung. In crowded lodging, houses like this common, in older Chinese districts where families rent small rooms off a shared courtyard, neighbors' police noise, the way guards police gates. A landlady's shout was the night watchman's bell. That shout and the absence of forced entry nudged investigators toward a cruelly simple idea. The man inside might have been known to them, or at least admitted before control flipped. Pressure swelled in the city like a storm that refused to break. Rumors forked, revenge for love, a thief who turned butcher, shops locked earlier. By 10 at night, about what Americans might think of as just after prime time, the lanes felt emptied of the usual late heat. The longer the case stretched, the heavier the hand on the police. They started where most bad explanations begin, with love and money. The victim's social map tilted toward men, friends, suitors, patrons between their early 20s and late 30s. The list grew to more than 260 names, married and unmarried alike. That was not an investigative lead. It was a census. Each name would take time, and time was the one thing the city would not lend. Then a father came forward, words pushed out through embarrassment and grief. He suspected his daughter's older lover, the one who had been married, then divorced, the one who called the parents to announce his clean break and ask their blessing. In the father's telling, the man had pressed for marriage while spending grew thinner. The daughter had pulled back, talking quietly at home about leaving. Arguments followed. The man's surname was Guo. He had a shop upstairs in a commercial building where the daughter, Ha Lian, worked the floor below. It sounded like the beginning of a motive, and beginnings have gravity in an investigation. The details deepen. Calls and texts around 1 in the morning while the women were still at the bar. The man arriving at the lodging house early the next day without being summoned. The rush into the courtyard, the grip of the doorknob, and the shock inside. He said he had panicked at silence, forced his way in when nobody answered, then sprinted to fetch the landlady. He admitted arguments, denied everything else, and held out his arm for a swab without being asked twice. The lab later answered in its flat language. His DNA was not the 4th profile. No match. The lovers stepped away from the center of the board, so detectives looped back to the other thread, the man at the bar. Staff remembered he had paid for drinks. They remembered a brief rain that kept the group inside for a handful of minutes before they scattered toward the night. Under flickering lights and 100 faces, the cashier kept her eyes on banknotes, not bone structure. She could not describe him except to say he was not a regular. The timeline however, cared less about faces than sequences. The women had left after 1. At 2:14 in the morning, a camera, a little over 100 meters, about 328 feet away, saw them moving toward home. Seconds later, it recorded a lone man entering the same alley, his back to the lens, his posture swallowed by night grain. That image, plus a male DNA at the scene, gave the unknown man weight he could not shrug off. Back in the courtyard, the room kept insisting on 2 things: control and injury. 2 victims carried no defensive cuts at all, killed where they sat, still bound. The youngest had almost freed one hand and tried to seize the blade, leaving that deep palm slice. And everywhere, those droplets, steady as a metronome, marking the stair and the flagstones beyond the door. Whoever left had bled, and not a little. In a place like this, a man cradling his right arm would be remembered by night shift nurses and taxi drivers counting cash at dawn. Police expanded their net, and their questions set. Was there a boyfriend hiding under another name? Was the unknown man from the bar the same man who ghosted the alley in the camera's corner? Could a stranger with a grievance follow 3 women into a courtyard and be admitted without force? The answers came slowly. The lover had an alibi, shaped by a phone, a taxi, and a camera. The barman had a name, Li Gang, and a video of his own residence showing him home until late morning. Those stones stayed put. The case waited for a different kind of footprint. The city's fear translated into motion. Notices went up on community boards. Text messages rippled through neighborhoods. Officers turned from doorbells to hospital desks, including traditional Chinese medicine clinics that open early and accept walk-ins who prefer cash to forms. What they hunted now was posture. A man who held his right forearm tight against his chest, who might explain a deep cut with a kitchen accident, who might have left before the ink on any logbook could dry. It was an old city method as much as a modern one. Follow the habits, and the habits will take you to a name. The investigation, viewed from a distance, looked almost plain. A staged ransack that fooled no one. A landlady scolding under a lit window. A tenant's half-waking witness to an argument. A camera that caught a shape. A list of more than 260 men that proved how crowded a social life can be. A lover who felt like a solution until science told him to go home. But taken together, those facts tightened like a tourniquet. Somewhere under them was a man with a cut he could not hide forever. The city had begun to look for him with its own eyes. At first light, the story split in 2. What the room insisted on and what the people around it believed. The room had already ruled out theft and lost the phones. Wallets, bags had stayed put in plain sight. Clothing remained neat. The ransack looked staged, not lived. 3 young women had been bound. 2 showed no defensive wounds. The youngest had a deep palm slice, the kind that comes from grabbing a blade to push it away. A dotted trail of blood led from the bedroom door, down the stairs, across the small courtyard, and out toward the lane before thinning to nothing. The women had died inside. The trail belonged to whoever left. The building remembered voices. Around 2 in the morning, the landlady stepped into the courtyard and scolded the upstairs room to be quiet. She heard a man's local accent, even controlled. She heard Halian answer sharp. A tenant down the hall woke, too. He heard the same rhythm, argument. The landlady's reprimand, then hush. Later, the forensic window, between 2 and 3 in the morning, would lay itself over those memories like tracing paper. No pry marks on the door. Either the lock yielded easily, or someone inside opened it when the man knocked. By morning, rumor wore 2 faces: a jealous lover or a thief who turned butcher. Shops in the quarter closed earlier than usual. By about 10 at night, what American viewers think of as just after prime time, the alleys felt emptied. The longer the case stretched, the heavier the city sat on the police. Detectives started with the people closest to the victims. The family's silence cracked. A father spoke, embarrassed and grieving, about an older man, surnamed Guo, who had pushed for marriage after his divorce. Money threaded through their history. Gifts, loans, expectations, calls and texts around 1 a.m. He had rushed to the lodging house on his own when he could not reach the women, forced the door, seen what was inside, run to fetch the landlady. He gave DNA without hesitation. The lab said no. His profile did not match the fourth blood at the scene. The center of suspicion moved away from him. The other thread ran back to the bar. Staff remembered a man who had shared the table, argued briefly over payment, then tossed down cash and covered the whole bill. Rain flared and held the group for a handful of minutes. After that, the women left. The cashier could not give a face. The lights flickered, and in such places people watch money more than bone structure. But the timeline held. At 2:14 in the morning, a camera, a little over 100 meters away, roughly 328 feet, caught the 3 women entering the alley toward home. Seconds later, a lone man followed them in, his back to the lens, his features swallowed by night grain. Around 5 in the morning, a camera on a different lane that connected to the same block saw a figure pass with his left hand clamped over his right forearm, head pitched forward, as if pain had weight. The posture read like injury. The room's blood trail had already said as much. Police pulled the bar thread taut. The drinking companion had a name. Li Gang. He told them Ha Lian had invited him. He had paid to be gallant. He had wanted to see them home. They had declined, said they would walk. Drunk and sleepy, he took a taxi. A driver and a building camera put him at his residence until late morning. The alibi held. He stepped off the board, which left the unknown man with the injured right arm, the one who followed, the one who likely bled as he fled. The city helped. Officers canvassed taxis, asking about pre-dawn fares cradling an arm. They visited large hospitals and small private clinics. And, crucially, traditional Chinese medicine facilities, common in many cities for early opening. Cash-based treatment? They broadcast appeals via neighborhood boards, local television, and SMS. They were not only looking for a name, they were looking for a wound, right hand or right forearm, deep enough to drip a breadcrumb trail. The ledger found them first, 5 days after the killings, on the same morning as the murders. Just after 7, one clinic's register listed a man with a severe cut to the right arm. He said a kitchen knife had slipped. He was bandaged in a hurry. He left without discharge paperwork. Cameras at the clinic captured his face. His identification on the intake sheet gave a name, Wanguyu. Sometimes a city makes its own luck. Detectives went to his room. In the closet, a pair of men's shoes pressed the floor with a sole pattern that matched the prints stamped in blood at the scene. His DNA matched the fourth profile. Confronted, he confessed. The next day, in a reenactment walkthrough that drew a thick ring of onlookers, crowds that gather in Chinese old quarters, the way news gathers on hot stones, he traced his route from the alley to the door, from the door to the beds, from the beds back into the morning. His right arm remained bandaged and fixed. He was calm. He answered without flourish. Control had been his language all along. His account started with alcohol and a spark. He had drunk until near midnight, drifted into sleep on warm stone steps. Something struck his head, he said, a bottle, and he woke to 3 women nearby. Words lit. Anger grew. The women walk. He followed, not close, but close enough to keep them in sight. He waited in the courtyard until their light came on. He went up. Inside, he found a small fruit knife, about the length Americans know as 8 inches, on a table. He waved it, told them to be quiet, ordered them to tie each other. They did, clumsily. When adrenaline sagged, he sat on the other bed, eyes closing. The youngest had already freed one hand. She grabbed the blade. In the fast, blind clinch, the knife sank into his right arm. He tore it back and stabbed her first. Still bleeding, shaking, he killed the other two where they sat. He bound his arm with a shirt from the wardrobe, left by a different route, and bled into dawn. He took nothing. He said he had wanted an apology, and then silence. What remained for the city were the after images. A mother whose body had learned grief's slow walk. A landlady replaying her steps into the courtyard. Shopkeepers closing early. Women carrying their phones lower and their eyes higher on the street. The investigation had looked almost plain when laid end-to-end staged ransack. Neighbors' testimony, 2 cameras, a ledger, a pair of shoes, a lab match, a confession. Plain did not mean simple. Plain meant honest about cause and effect. Words cut first. Then steel followed. In November of 2012, the court wrote the end that the evidence had already drafted. In a system where multiple victims, clear forensic links, and a confession align, capital sentences arrive swiftly. The quarter exhaled without relief. The families could not exhale at all. What breaks a night is not the hour, but the choice. In the old quarter, where rooms opened onto a shared courtyard and voices traveled like small birds, 3 young women had returned from a bar, and a man who felt wronged followed the echo of their laughter home. By first light, the room had argued down the simplest theories. Phones, wallets, and bags lay where they could be seen. Clothing stayed neat. The scattered drawers felt staged, not lived. 3 people were bound. 2 showed no defensive cuts. The youngest bore a deep slice across her palm, the mark of a hand that has tried to seize a blade. From the bedroom to the stair, from the courtyard to the lane, a dotted trail of blood moved outward. The women died inside. The trail belonged to the one who left. The building remembered the hour. Around 2 in the morning, the landlady stepped beneath the upstairs window and scolded the noise back into the walls. She heard a man's local accent, low and even, and Ha Lien's voice, sharp as glass. A tenant woke too, caught the same rhythm, raised voices, then a reprimand, then hush. Later, the forensic window between 2 and 3 in the morning settled over those memories like tracing paper. There were no pry marks on the door. Either the lock yielded easily, or someone inside opened it when the man knocked. In crowded houses like this, hosts keep peace, the way guards keep gates. A landlady's shout is the night watchman's bell. The city needed a name. First came the bar companion Li Gang, who paid the bill and wanted to see the women home. He took a taxi instead. Building cameras put him inside his residence until late morning. He stepped off the board. Investigators widened their net and their questions set. Who else had moved through those lanes in the dead hours? What posture does pain teach a body? On one camera, linked by the maze of alleys to the victim's lane, around 5 in the morning, a figure passed with his head pitched forward and his left hand clamped over his right forearm as if binding a leak. The room had already told them that someone bled on the way out. The camera offered a body to match the blood. The city helped, in the way old cities do, through habits and ledgers and faces remembered at front desks. Clinics that open early, especially traditional medicine facilities where walk-ins pay cash, keep a different sort of memory. A register line, a wound described, a departure without forms. Detectives worked taxis and triage counters and bulletin boards. They were hunting posture now, not just names. A man who held his right arm tight to his chest and explained a deep cut with a kitchen story. The ledger found them first. A traditional clinic noted, just after 7 in the morning, on the day of the killings, a man with a severe cut to his right arm. He gave a name, Wang Guiyu, and left without discharge paperwork. Cameras caught his face in the doorway. Sometimes a city makes its own luck. They went to his room. A pair of men's shoes pressed an outsoled pattern into the dust that matched prints stamped in blood at the scene. A swab from his cheek matched the male profile in the room's fourth DNA. Confronted, he confessed. The next day, during a reenactment that drew neighbors in choking numbers, alleys and boulevards, clogged as if for a festival, he traced the route from the mouth of the alley to the door, from the door to the beds, from the beds back into the morning. His right arm was still bandaged and fixed. His face remained calm. He answered without flourish, as though control were a language he had always spoken. His account began with alcohol and a spark. Late on June 23rd, he said he had finished hospital paperwork for his grandmother and should have stayed to watch the night. Instead, friends messaged and pulled him into a meal that turned into a drinking session. Near midnight, what many in the United States would call just after late night hours, he drifted out, swaying, and lay down on the warm steps of a public square. He slept. Then an impact glass thrown, he claimed, snapped him awake, pain singing at his scalp. 3 women were near, words lit. He demanded an apology. They mocked him, he said, or at least refused to soothe the sting. The detail that he had been hurt mattered more to him than who had done the hurting. Injury needed a payer. Rage needed a face. When they walked away, he followed, not close, but close enough to keep them in sight. He knew the lanes. He waited in the courtyard until a light came on upstairs. He climbed. He pushed in. Inside, a small fruit knife lay on a table about 8 inches long, roughly 20 centimeters, and the man took it up. He waved it and told them to be quiet. He ordered them to tie one another's wrists and ankles. They fumbled through the knots. Alcohol makes courage loud and judgment small. His story carried both. He sat on the other bed. He said he closed his eyes. Anger has its own exhaustion. The youngest had worked one hand free. She took the knife. In the fast, close struggle that followed, the blade sank into his right forearm, deep enough to leave a breadcrumb trail from the door to the lane. Pain turned his anger into purpose. He tore the knife back and stabbed her first, still bleeding, shaking. He killed the other 2 where they sat bound. He bound his own arm with a shirt from the wardrobe and left by a different route, head pitched, left hand clamping right, bleeding into dawn. He took nothing. He said he had wanted an apology. Then silence. Crowds gathered when detectives brought him back to point out each step. Old Quarter curiosity has its own gravity. People squeezed onto balconies and into doorways, shoulder to shoulder, to see the man who had turned a neighbor's room into a killing ground. He moved calmly from alley to stair, spoke softly about where he had stood and how he had forced the women to tie one another, and where he had dozed, and how the knife had slipped or flashed or stuck. He did not narrate these parts with the heat that they deserved, only with the clarity of someone describing a past he had already boxed and labeled. In Chinese cities, crime scene walkthroughs can draw crowds the way market days do. The ritual of reenactment is a strange mix of education, theater, and closure. Here it served as one more measure of his composure. Investigators measured his story against what the house had witnessed. The landlady's scolding and the tenant's half-waking memory of voices fit the time window. The trail of droplets fit the wound. The lack of forced entry fit a door opened before control flipped. The posture on the 5 in the morning camera, the head pitched forward, the left hand binding the right, fit the injury he admitted. In the end, the fit was not artistic, it was mechanical. Each tooth of the gear found its notch. What the case then asked for was motive's fuller shape, Alcohol explains volume, but not direction. The man's grievance, struck by a thrown bottle. Hurt, denied apology was the match. Control was the fuel. He had followed when he could have stopped. He had armed himself when he could have walked away. He had ordered the women to tie one another when he could have chosen the door again. Somewhere between the square and the upstairs room, injury turned into entitlement. In many neighborhoods like this, where people live close and nights are thin-walled, public scolding by a landlady is a cultural pressure valve meant to minimize harm by shaming noise back into quiet. In this story, that bell rang, but the harm had already been invited upstairs. He told the police he did not know the women, had only met them that night. He said he could not even remember their faces afterwards. That, too, is a kind of control, turning victims into blanks on which to write anger. He spoke about being pushed, about being mocked, about a bottle. He did not speak in the language of names. The city, however, spoke in the language of facts: a clinic ledger, a camera, a pair of shoes, a lab match, a confession. The reenactment sealed the line from his version to the room that had already told its own. When judgment came months later, the court wrote, "The end the evidence had already drafted." In systems where multiple deaths, clear forensic ties, and a confession align, capital sentences arrive with speed. Neighborhoods adjusted on the surface, the shops stayed open a little later again, and people in the lanes talked more softly about what had happened. But fear leaves a film that rain does not wash. Mothers still counted keys twice. Women, walking after dark, gripped their phones lower and raised their eyes higher at corners. The lesson people actually follow is practical. Safety is a choreography, not a charm. From a distance, the investigation can look almost plain. Staged ransack, neighbor's testimony, 2 cameras, a clinic entry, an outsole pattern, a DNA match, a reenactment, a sentence. Plain does not mean simple. It means honest about cause and effect. Words cut first. Steel followed. The night had not run out of eyes. It had run out of chances. By morning, the story no longer belonged only to the room. It belonged to the people who had to live with what the room had seen. The suspect said he did not take a thing, did not ransack the place, and that the open drawers were the result of a cruel order. He had told the women to find rope and tie one another. So doors and cupboards gaped because the victims had opened them, not because he had come for loot. He said he tore a shirt from the wardrobe, bound his right arm tight, and slipped out by another route. The blood that dotted the stair in the courtyard had already said as much. It belonged to the one who left, not the dead. Families rarely accept a killer's version of the night that took their own. The victim's relatives called his account a performance crafted to push blame onto the dead, to turn resistance into provocation. But the city's facts are stubborn. There was a cut on the man's head that could have been made by glass. It had scabbed over in a time frame that fit the hours he described. The building, too, remembered what it had heard. A man's voice, calm and local, and Halien's voice raised, sharp with anger. Just after 2 in the morning, then the landlady's reprimand, then hush. The suspect confessed, and the next day he walked the alleys with detectives, retracing what he said were his steps. Neighbors packed doorways and balconies until the lanes felt like a festival. The suspect's right arm still bandaged and fixed. He spoke without flourish, pointing from alley mouth to stair, from stair to door, from door to bed, a composure that struck many as its own kind of violence. The calm did not change the facts that had already been collected. 3 young women, tied, 2 without defensive wounds, 1 with a deep palm slice from grabbing a blade. No valuables missing. A staged ransack that fooled no one. He said he had never known them before that night. that he could not even remember their faces afterwards. That, too, is a posture of control, reducing people to blanks on which anger can be written. He said the night began with alcohol and a spark in a public square, a bottle thrown, or at least glass that cut, and a demand for an apology that was refused. When the women walked away, he followed slowly, drunkenly, but close enough to keep them in sight, and waited in the courtyard beneath their window until a light came on. Then he climbed. Then he pushed in. The landlady heard voices, scolded from the dark. Then the argument stopped. The forensic window between 2 and 3 in the morning settled over that hush like tracing paper. What happened inside, he described with a bleak economy. He told them to be quiet. He ordered them to tie one another. He sat on the other bed, anger straining against fatigue. The youngest had nearly freed one hand. When his head dipped, she grabbed the knife. In the close struggle that followed, the blade sank into his right arm. He wrenched it back and stabbed her first. Then, still bleeding and shaking, killed the other two, where they sat bound. He left by a different route, bleeding into dawn. He took nothing. He wanted, he said, an apology and then silence. The families did not accept any of this as mitigation. The city did not need it to. A confession, clear forensic ties, and the simple arithmetic of the scene already drew a straight line. Still, in the days that followed, the investigation had to tell itself the story again and again, not to excuse it, but to be certain it understood the chain of choices that had carried a man from a square to a room where 3 people died. The police rechecked everything. The cameras near the alley that showed the women at 2:14 in the morning, and a lone man seconds behind. The other lens on a different lane around 5 that recorded a figure with head pitched forward, left hand clamping the right forearm, moving as if to hold something inside. The ledgers and calls and interviews that had cleared other suspects. There had been other names. The man from the Bar Lee gang had paid the bill and wanted to see the women home, but a taxi and a building camera put him inside his residence until late morning. He stepped off the board. There was also the older lover, Guo, who had pressed for marriage and arrived at the lodging house on his own when he could not reach the women. He offered DNA without hesitation. The lab said the 4th blood at the scene was not his. He was not the man in the alley, and he was not the man who left a dotted trail to the gate. So the case turned inward toward the killer's history. Friends called him odd, a quiet man with a stubborn streak that could go rigid without warning. The family was poor and propped up by social assistance. His mother lived with a mild intellectual disability. He was the only son with 2 older sisters and had left school to work, sending money home month after month. He said in the holding cell that he was empty with regret, more afraid for his parents than for himself, and that after what he had done, he expected the sentence that would come. When detectives tried to pry for more detail, anything that might explain what had tipped the balance, he would not answer. These are the parts that cannot be graphed by forensics. How a grievance turns into entitlement. How a demand for apology becomes a demand for control. How control becomes the theater of tying and then steel. Some threads are cultural, not as excuses, but as background. In dense, old city housing, everyone lives within earshot. A landlady's scolding is a small civic pressure valve meant to push noise back into quiet. It rang that night, but the harm had already been invited upstairs. In bars, where the light stutters and 100 customers come and go, the cashier remembers the weight of cash more than faces. That, too, is how a name can slide past a night. In neighborhoods where clinics open early and take walk-ins in cash, ledgers remember what people intend to forget. Those are habits that help a city catch a man who left his own blood behind. The public's attention had another gravity. After 3 deaths, streets empty earlier, parents double count keys. Women rehearse the choreography of safety, phone in hand, eyes up at corners. The reenactment satisfied curiosity and anger for a day. But it did not return the night that had been taken. The court would finish what the evidence had already written, and the families would enter the long country of grief, where calendars do not matter. The suspect's calm at the walk-through, bandage white against his right arm, voice, even as he described where he had stood and what he had done, will remain for many the truest image of what was broken. In the end, the case read like a set of simple machines, meshing, staged ransack that convinced no one. Neighbors' testimony to an argument and a reprimand. 2 cameras that held shape and posture without a face. An older lover eliminated by science. A bar companion eliminated by time and lens. A man who followed and bled. A ledger line that kept his name. None of this needs myth. It needs only to be told plainly, so that the night can be understood for what it was. Not a mystery solved by genius, but a chain of choices that could have broken at any point, and did not. In the morning after, the city tried to retell the night, as if order could be returned by narration. The facts, at least, held steady. Nothing had been taken. Phones, wallets, bags left in plain sight were still there. Drawers gaped, but the disarray felt staged. A theater of mess, meant to imitate theft. The 3 women were bound. 2 bore no defensive wounds. The youngest carried that deep palm slice, the mark of someone who had grabbed a blade to stop it. From the bedroom to the stair, from the courtyard to the lane, a dotted trail of blood marched outward and thinned into the dawn. That trail belonged to the person who left, not the dead. The building itself remembered the hour. Around 2 in the morning, the landlady stepped into the courtyard and scolded the upstairs room. Her voice, the makeshift night watch found in old lodging houses. She heard a man's local accent, low and even. She heard Halien's voice, sharp with anger, then quiet, the kind that reads as peace until you learn a different definition. A tenant's half-waking memory matched the same rhythm. Later, forensic timing would settle between 2 and 3 in the morning. A tracing paper overlay on those sounds. There were no pry marks on the door. Either the lock yielded easily, or someone inside opened it. In a city of close courtyards, peace is often kept by scolding. That night, the bell rang, but harm had already climbed the stairs. The suspect confessed. The next day, he walked the alleys with detectives, right arm bandaged and fixed, pointing from alley mouth to stair, from stair to door, from door to bed. Neighbors packed doorways and balconies until the lane looked like a small festival. He spoke without flourish. The calm struck many as its own kind of violence. But calm could not change what had already been collected. 3 young women bound, 2 without defensive injuries, 1 with a deep palm slice, no valuables missing. A ransack that fooled no one. He said he had not known the women before that night. He said he could not even remember their faces afterward. He said the spark was a bottle, or at least glass, thrown while he dozed in a public square, that it cut his scalp and angered him, and that when he asked for an apology, he received mockery instead. Whether or not the words were cruel, the head wound itself was real, scabbed over on a timeline that fit the night. In his telling, refusal gave grievance direction. When the women walked away, he followed slow and drunk, but close enough to keep them in sight, and waited below their window until a light came on. Then he climbed. Then he pushed in. The landlady heard the voices and called for quiet. Then hush. Science later drew its line through that hush. What happened inside, he described without ornament. He told them to be quiet. He ordered them to tie one another. He sat on the other bed, anger tightening across fatigue. The youngest had nearly freed one hand. When his head dipped, she seized the knife. In the close fight that followed, the blade sank into his right forearm. He tore it back and stabbed her first. Still bleeding and shaking, he killed the other two where they sat. He wrapped his arm with a shirt from the wardrobe and left by another route. Bleeding into mourning, he said he took nothing. He said he had wanted an apology and then silence. Around those assertions ran the city's other facts. Cameras close to the alley saw the three women at 2:14 and seconds later. A lone man step in behind them. On another lane linked to the same block, around 5 in the morning, a lens caught a figure with his head pitched forward, left hand clamping his right forearm as if holding something in. The room had already said someone bled on the way out. The camera gave that blood a posture. Other suspects, the obvious ones, had already been carved away by time and images. The man from the bar, Li Gang, had paid the bill but took a taxi home. A driver and a building camera kept him inside until late morning. Investigation is often a discipline of subtraction. The older lover Guo arrived at the lodging house early, panicked by silence, forced the door, and shouted for the landlady. His DNA did not match the male profile from the scene. His alibi held. He was not the man who followed into the alley, and he was not the man who left the dotted trail to the gate. So the story turned toward the question people always ask when anger lights a fuse. Where could it have been cut? The opponent's telling leans heavily on behavior, on words exchanged in a square and in a room, on what apology might have cost and what mockery might have bought. But accountability does not migrate simply because tempers do. Responsibility remains with the one who followed, armed himself, ordered tying, and then killed. Still, there are practical lessons that do not change that truth. In dense old city housing, a midnight quarrel draws eyes and voices. Landladies, tenants, neighbors, and those intervening shouts are a civic pressure valve. They shift many nights back toward quiet. They cannot always rescue the night that has been invited upstairs. There is also the choreography of safety, which women in many cities practice without announcing it. Choose light over shadow. Keep to the open when a stranger follows. Call for another pair of eyes, a guard, a vendor, a driver, a neighbor, rather than argue inside a room. Name the threat out loud in the courtyard. Where shame sometimes works faster than law, call the police early, not after the door has closed. None of these measures is a guarantee. They are simply the habits that make some nights survivable. The case, read end to end, still looks like a chain of simple machines, meshing a staged ransack. Neighbors' testimony of an argument and a reprimand. 2 cameras that offered sequence and posture without a face. A ledger and lab work that closed other doors. A confession that walked back through the alleys. It does not need myth. It needs the plain telling of cause and effect. Words cut first that night. Steel followed. And when the city finally spoke in the language of courts, it wrote the end the evidence had already drafted. If there is a final lesson, it is this. Apology offered early is sometimes a cheaper currency than pride, and walking away is sometimes the bravest choreography. None of that relocates guilt. It only maps the narrow paths by which ordinary nights remain ordinary.